November 16, 1951. The morning fog lifts off Portsmouth Harbor as Captain Dennis Campbell climbs the gangway to HMS Illustrious. In his briefcase rests a single sheet of paper, a diagram so simple a child could draw it, a flight deck angled 10 degrees to port. Nothing revolutionary on its face. But what he doesn't know is that within 18 months, this sketch will save more naval aviators' lives than any weapon system ever invented. Before we get any deeper, hit subscribe. Seriously, if you love real history told with actual spine and not the Discovery Channel bedtime diaper edit, this is where you belong. Hit it now before the algorithm buries this video under another Minecraft documentary about the history of dirt. Like the video too. You're already here, don't be shy. What Captain Campbell does know, however, terrifies him. In the past 12 months alone, the Royal Navy lost 43 aircraft to landing accidents, 43 machines destroyed, 17 pilots killed, dozens more maimed. Every single loss occurred during the final 30 seconds of flight. That desperate moment when a 30-ton jet traveling 140 miles per hour attempts to catch a wire on a pitching deck while a steel barricade waits 60 feet ahead, ready to shred any aircraft that misses. The Americans faced even worse numbers. In 1951, U.S. Navy carrier aviation suffered 776 Class A mishaps, accidents resulting in death or aircraft loss, more than 2 per day during peacetime. The Korean War amplified the carnage. USS Boxer reported 7 barrier crashes in a single deployment. Princeton lost 9 aircraft in 4 weeks. On straight-deck carriers, missing the arresting wires meant one outcome. You hit the barricade at full throttle, or you plowed into the aircraft parked forward, creating a fireball that could kill a dozen men in seconds. The jet age had arrived, but carrier aviation couldn't keep up. The F-9F Panther landed 40 knots faster than the propeller-driven Hellcat. The new jet engines took 7 seconds to spool up from idle, an eternity when you're sinking toward the ocean at 20 feet per second. Landing signal officers stood on the carrier's port quarter, frantically waving paddles. But by the time a pilot recognized he was coming in too low, too fast, or too high, physics had already written his fate. Every admiral, every engineer, every test pilot knew the truth. Carrier aviation had reached its breaking point. Jets were the future. But futures don't matter when the present is killing your people. What Captain Campbell doesn't know, what nobody in that Portsmouth meeting room knows, is that his insane idea will be rejected, mocked, and called impossible by the very experts whose job is solving impossible problems. And that the breakthrough will come not from committees or wind tunnels, but from one man's refusal to accept that good men should die for a design flaw. The problem began in 1945, the moment Lieutenant Commander William P. Bill Runn made the first jet landing aboard USS Wake Island. His FR-1 Fireball touched down at 90 knots, 20 knots faster than any piston fighter, and the arresting gear cables screamed as they absorbed the kinetic energy. The landing was successful. The warning was ignored. By 1950, every major navy faced the same crisis. Jet engines revolutionized speed and altitude, but their slow throttle response created a deadly trap. On propeller aircraft, pilots chopped throttle on the landing signal officer's cut signal and literally fell onto the deck. Jets couldn't do that. They had to land power on, maintain and thrust until the wheels touched because their engines took too long to accelerate if they needed to go around. This created a hellish scenario. Pilots flew their final approach with engines spooled up, committed to landing, unable to climb quickly if they missed the wires. On a straight deck carrier, 4 arresting wires stretched across 60 feet of deck. Behind them, the crash barricade, a web of steel cables designed to catch aircraft that missed. Behind that, rows of parked aircraft, fuel trucks, ammunition carts, everything needed to turn the flight deck into an active combat zone. The mathematics were brutal. A Panther landing at 125 knots covered 211 feet per second. If a pilot missed all 4 wires, he had exactly 2.1 seconds before hitting the barricade. The barricade worked, sometimes. When it failed, 30 tons of jet fuel and ordnance plowed into the aircraft parked forward at 100 miles per hour. Captain Bruce Williams, Air Operations Officer on USS Kearsarge, watched 11 men die when a barrier failed in March 1951. The accident report noted, aircraft struck barrier at full power. Barrier separated. Aircraft continued forward into 6 parked Corsairs. Resulting fire reached aviation gasoline stores. 14 aircraft destroyed, 11 personnel killed, 23 injured. Carrier operation suspended 48 hours. The solution everyone tried: better barriers. The British developed the flex deck, a rubberized landing surface that theoretically could catch jets without landing gear. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown made 40 landings on the system at Farnborough. He called it fundamentally sound in reports. He called it bloody terrifying to his friends. The Americans built stronger barricades. The Bureau of Aeronautics spent $3.2 million developing the Davis barrier system, a mechanical web that could stop a 25,000-pound aircraft at full throttle. When it worked, it was impressive. When it failed, the devastation was total. But stronger barriers didn't prevent crashes. They just contained them. Every senior aviator knew the real problem: the flight deck itself. Captain William T. Rashour, head of Aviation Military Characteristics at the Office of the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, wrote in June 1945, "Current landing procedures force all aircraft into a 60-foot impact zone with zero margin for error. This is incompatible with jet aircraft performance characteristics." Translation: we designed our carriers for propeller aircraft that could land at 70 knots and abort at the last second. Jets land at 130 knots and can't abort. We're trying to land 1,952 aircraft on 1,942 ships. People will die until we fix this. Everyone agreed. Everyone saw the problem. But nobody could solve it. The British tried flex decks. The Americans tried better barriers and backup barriers and emergency net systems. The French tried reducing aircraft weight. Nothing worked. The accident rate climbed. What they needed was someone crazy enough to question the one thing nobody questioned. Why does the landing area have to be parallel to the ship's axis? What they needed was Dennis Campbell. Captain Dennis Royal Farquhar Campbell wasn't supposed to solve anything. He was a bureaucrat. Born November 13, 1907 in Southsea, England, Campbell entered the Royal Navy in 1925 as a midshipman. He qualified as a pilot in September 1931, early enough to fly fabric biplanes, late enough to understand that naval aviation wasn't a gentleman's hobby, but a profession that demanded engineering precision. During World War II, he flew Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, the obsolete aircraft that nonetheless crippled the Bismarck. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Nobody called him a genius. Nobody called him a visionary. After the war, the Admiralty assigned him to the Ministry of Supply as Deputy Chief R.N. Representative, a desk job managing technical liaison between the Navy and civilian contractors. He had 0 engineering credentials, no advanced degrees. His job was paperwork, tracking development schedules, attending coordination meetings, signing requisitions. But Dennis Campbell had one quality that credentials can't teach. He couldn't ignore dead pilots. In 1951, he attended the funeral of Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, a test pilot killed when his jet hit the barricade on HMS Implacable. Lithgow had been Campbell's student, 23 years old, perfect approach, perfect speed. But he floated 6 feet too far and missed the wires. The barricade failed. Lithgow's aircraft disintegrated. His widow was 5 months pregnant. Campbell stood at that graveside and later told his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart, "This is insane. We're murdering them with our own equipment. A pilot does everything right and still dies because 60 feet isn't enough margin for error. There has to be another way." Goodhart expected nothing more. Officers say things like that at funerals. But Campbell kept obsessing. He pulled accident reports. He interviewed LSOs. He studied landing patterns. He wasn't an engineer, so he did what non-engineers do. He drew pictures. The revelation came during a train ride from Portsmouth to London. Campbell sketched carrier decks in his notebook, trying to visualize how to give pilots more room. If you can't make the landing area longer, make it wider. If you can't make it wider because the ship has a fixed beam, angle it. Angle it. He drew a flight deck canted 10 degrees to port. Now, the landing zone didn't end at the barricade. It ended in open water. A pilot who missed the wires could shove his throttle forward, climb away, and try again. No barricade, no parked aircraft, no catastrophic collision, just air and ocean and a second chance. The idea was so simple it felt stupid, which meant either he'd discovered something brilliant or he'd overlooked something obvious that every real engineer already knew. On August 7, 1951, Captain Dennis Campbell convened a meeting at the Ministry of Supply. In attendance, Louis Boddington, Director of Naval Air Department Farnborough, Rear Admiral M.S. Slattery, Chief of Naval Research, and 6 senior aviation engineers. Campbell opened his briefcase and showed them his sketch. The room erupted. That is completely illegal. Commander James, Senior Flight Operations Specialist, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words hit like a pronouncement from physics itself. The International Air Navigation Convention requires all flight operations to align with vessel axis. What you're proposing violates maritime aviation law written after 15 years of carrier operations. This isn't innovation, Captain. It's amateur nonsense. Campbell had expected resistance. He hadn't expected condescension. James continued. You're asking pilots to land across the ship's natural motion. Carriers pitch and roll around their keel. An angled deck means pilots approach at an angle to that motion. They'll be fighting drift constantly. The landing area will be moving underneath them in ways they can't anticipate. You'll increase crashes, not reduce them. Lieutenant Commander Goodhart started to respond, but Louis Boddington, the civilian engineer from Farnborough, held up his hand. Show me the math. Campbell blinked. I beg your pardon. The math, Boddington repeated. You say pilots will fight drift. Calculate it. An 8-degree angle on a deck moving through 12-degree rolls. What's the differential drift over a 30-second approach? Silence. Boddington looked at the other engineers. Anyone? Nobody spoke. Then we test it, Boddington said. Captain Campbell, the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough has a painted outline runway. We can paint an angled deck outline on HMS Triumph's flight deck. In 1 week, we run simulated touch-and-go approaches. If the drift problem is real, we'll measure it. If it's theoretical catastrophizing, we'll know that too. Rear Admiral Slattery leaned back. Lewis, you understand that if you paint an angled deck on Triumph and pilots start crashing, you're ending both your career and Captain Campbell's. Noted, sir. And if it works? Boddington smiled. Then we stopped killing pilots who did everything right. The tests began September 1951. HMS Triumph left Portsmouth with an angled deck painted in white outline across her axial flight deck. Not a structural modification, just paint. For 3 weeks, Navy pilots made touch-and-go approaches, pretending the painted line was a real deck edge. The drift problem predicted didn't exist. Pilots adapted in 2 landings. What they discovered instead was freedom. Lieutenant Peter Childerton, one of the test pilots, later wrote, "I came in too high, floated past the wires, and for the first time in my career, I wasn't terrified. I just poured on power and climbed away. No barrier waiting to kill me, no aircraft ahead, just clean air and a second chance. I felt like I'd been given my life back." By October, the painted deck trials proved the concept worked. Now came the hard part, convincing everyone else, because HMS Triumph was British, and the carrier with the biggest problem, the carrier whose pilots were dying at twice the Royal Navy's rate, was American. And the U.S. Navy didn't take kindly to British officers telling them how to land planes. September 14, 1951. U.S. Naval Air Test Center, Patuxent River, Maryland. Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown stands in front of 40 American test pilots and feels every eye in the room calculating whether to trust him. Brown is the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, the man who's landed more aircraft types than anyone in history. He holds every British naval aviation record that matters. And right now, none of that matters, because he's about to tell the U.S. Navy that their carriers are designed wrong. "Gentlemen," Brown begins, "in the past 12 months, how many of you have hit the barricade?" 7.
Headlights moving fast. A Soviet search party sent to find him. He exhaled. As he drifted lower, he heard shouting from the ground. "Pilot, over here! Hold on, we see you!" The earth raced up to meet him. Talalikhin bent his knees, braced, and hit. The landing knocked the breath from his lungs, but he stayed upright. He collapsed to one knee, clutching his side. Pain shot through his ribs, cracked maybe, broken. He forced himself up, yanked free from his parachute straps, and staggered forward. Red Army infantry emerged from the tree line, rifles raised, then lowered as they recognized his flight uniform. One of them sprinted toward him, a young lieutenant in a wool greatcoat. "Comrade pilot, we thought we lost you," he said, grabbing him by the arm. Talalikhin wiped the blood from his forehead with the back of his glove. "It will take more than a heinkel to kill me," he muttered. The soldiers stared at him, not with pity, but awe. They had seen the fireball in the sky. They had watched the explosion. None of them believed anyone could survive that. A medic rushed forward. Talalikhin waved him off. "I don't need a doctor, I need a radio." The lieutenant blinked. A radio? Talalikian nodded. I'm not done. That bomber wasn't alone. There are more out there. He was right. Even now, German raiders, Heinkels, Dorniers, Junkers were swarming toward Moscow under the cover of night. The Luftwaffe thought the Soviet defenses were broken, that the Red Air Force was dying. But not tonight. Talalikin followed the soldiers toward a waiting gauze truck, limping slightly but refusing help. The lieutenant looked at him as if he were something more than a man, something forged from Russian iron and frost. Then he said the words that would echo across Russia by sunrise. Comrade, you rammed a bomber. In midair. Why? Talalikian paused at the truck door. His answer was simple. Because I ran out of bullets. 2 hours later, the Soviet propaganda machine exploded. By dawn, Radio Moscow declared Viktor Talalikin the first Soviet pilot to perform a nighttime aerial ramming attack and survive. Newspapers called him a fearless guardian of the motherland. Crowds gathered outside Red Army recruitment stations. Talalikin was hailed a hero across the USSR. Morning came heavy and cold over Moscow. Fighter engines coughed to life on airfields still blackened by bomb craters. Mechanics worked with frost-bitten fingers. Pilots who had slept only 2 hours dragged themselves back into their cockpits. The war didn't stop just because someone became a hero. But Viktor Talalikin didn't return to the sky that morning. He was taken to Moscow, not to rejoin his squadron, but to meet government officials from the Soviet Information Bureau. His ramming attack had made him the new face of Soviet resistance, the perfect symbol. The Kremlin needed him. The people needed him. The truth, that was optional. A legend is manufactured. Talalikin sat in a dimly lit office near Red Square, still wearing his scorched flight jacket. His cuts were bandaged, his ribs taped. Across from him sat 2 senior officers from the Soviet Press Bureau, a political commissar and a stenographer. A pile of papers was slid across the table to him. Hero pilot speaks, victory in the night sky. They handed him a pencil. Sign it, the commissar said. Talalikin skimmed the first lines. The article claimed he volunteered for a ramming attack, that he chose to sacrifice himself for the motherland, that he intentionally saved Moscow by colliding with the bomber. That wasn't how it happened. He looked up. This isn't accurate, he said. One of the press officers adjusted his glasses. It is now. Talalikin clenched his jaw. I ran out of ammunition, he said. I was going to force the Heinkel down. The collision was an act of heroic courage, the commissar interrupted. One that every Soviet citizen must hear about. Talalikin stared at him. I didn't intend to die. The commissar leaned closer. And yet you were prepared to, yes? Talalikin didn't answer. Silence filled the room. Through the window, he could hear the distant rumble of artillery. The war was still there, waiting. He signed the paper. That afternoon, Soviet radio began broadcasting his heroic interview. By midnight, Pravda, the state newspaper, published his story on the front page. People wept in train stations as they heard it. Mothers told their children to remember the name Talalikin. He was proof that even a single Soviet pilot could bring down fascist machines. Whispers among pilots. Inside air regiments scattered across the Western Front, pilots gathered around oil drum fires, whispering about the so-called ramming attack. Ramming a bomber at night? He's mad. No, he's a hero. A hero? Or a fool who got lucky? Maybe he had no choice. Command barely gives us enough ammo to hunt one bomber. You think he did it because he wanted to? No pilot wants to. In private, Soviet pilots knew the truth nobody would ever admit publicly. Ramming was not strategy, it was desperation. With half their aircraft destroyed in the first weeks of the war, with ammunition depots bombed, with fuel rationed, and with pilots sent into combat after as little as 5 hours of flight training, what choice did they have? They could withdraw and face the wrath of political officers, or they could ram and become a hero or a corpse. The official file, restricted access. Decades later, when Soviet archives briefly opened in the 1990s, a classified military report was found. It confirmed Talalekin was never instructed to perform Taran. He launched with less than 120 rounds of cannon ammunition, far below standard load. An internal note from the 3rd Air Army Command stated, Pilot Talalekin did not choose Taran as an attack doctrine. Ammunition depletion forced close interception, leading to collision. A handwritten note in the file added, the political impact of voluntary Taran is significant. Do not alter official version. The truth was brutal. Talalekin was brave, fearless even, but he didn't ram that bomber as part of some bright, glorious plan. He rammed it because the Red Air Force was collapsing, because his guns were empty, because nobody else could stop that bomber. Call it desperation, call it patriotism, call it duty, but don't call it clean. Talalekin would become a hero of the Soviet Union, medals pinned to his chest, speeches written in his honor. But glory doesn't last long in war, and fate wasn't done with him yet. The medal ceremony was brief. A small stage, red banners, political officials who smiled too wide, reporters who scribbled quotes that had already been written. Viktor Talalekin stood at attention as they pinned the hero of the Soviet Union gold star to his chest. It was supposed to feel meaningful. It didn't. They handed him a speech to read. He stared at it, then set it aside. Instead, he spoke only one sentence to the crowd. I did my duty, nothing more. No slogans, no propaganda, no speeches about Stalin or the unbreakable spirit of socialism. Just duty. The officer shifted uncomfortably. The crowd roared. He should have stayed in Moscow after that, touring factories, motivating workers, visiting schools, raising war bonds. That's what the Soviet state wanted from him, a living poster. But Viktor Talalekin didn't want posters. He wanted his squadron. He wanted the front. He wanted to fight. And that made him dangerous. Back to the sky. Against the advice of high-ranking officials, Talalekin returned to active duty. He refused ceremonial assignments and insisted on flying combat missions near Podolsk, south of Moscow. The German advance was tightening. The Luftwaffe was relentless. He rejoined the 177th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the same unit he had flown with the night he rammed the Henkel. But things had changed since then. The regiment had lost aircraft. Pilots he once flew with were gone, burned alive or buried under wreckage. His comrades greeted him with slaps on the shoulder and cups of black tea, but even they looked at him differently now. He wasn't just another pilot anymore. He was the Talalekin. And legends don't survive long at the front.
A fight he didn't need to take. October 27th, 1941. A brutal gray dawn. Freezing fog rolled across the pine forests near the village of Podolsk. Talalihin zipped his flight jacket up to his throat and pulled his gloves tight. He was still battered from his ramming mission. His ribs hadn't fully healed, but he hid the pain well. "Another night patrol?" he asked the ground chief. "Routine," the chief replied. "Enemy scouts reported near the rail lines. Could be nothing." Nothing. In war, nothing usually means death. Talalihin climbed into his Yak-1 fighter, a different aircraft from the Lag-3 he had lost in the ramming mission. Sleeker, faster, more responsive. He ran his pre-flight checks, signaled thumbs up, and the prop spun to life. He lifted off and climbed into the bitter sky with 2 wingmen. For 20 minutes, they saw nothing but cloud and sky. Then, radio crackle. "Spectre 1, I see movement. North by northwest, altitude 1500. Talalihin narrowed his eyes. Then he saw them. 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, German fighters, hunters. But they hadn't seen him yet. He could have pulled back, waited for backup, reported contact, and regrouped. Instead, he said into the radio, "Stay high, I'll take the lead." He nosed over and dove. This would be his final fight. The Yak-1 cut through the mist. Talalihin opened fire, machine gun tracers slicing toward the lead Messerschmitt. The German broke left into a defensive roll. The second dove to flank Talalihin. It became a knife fight. Low altitude, high speed, no room for error. Talalihin pulled into a climbing spiral. His engine screamed, metal strained. He flipped the Yak and got behind one of the Messerschmitts, lined up, fired. Hit. Pieces of the 109 tore free as black smoke poured from its engine. It went down. One left. The second Messerschmitt dove to escape. Talalihin followed. They tore through a cloud bank and came out over the pine forest, barely 300 meters above the ground. Too low. Too fast. The German pilot pulled a brutal turn, trying to get behind Talalihin. For a split second, their wings almost touched. They passed each other in a blur and climbed in opposite spirals. Then, it happened. A burst of machine gun fire tore across Talalihin's canopy. A second German fighter, unseen in the clouds above, had joined the fight. Before Talalihin could react, rounds pierced his cockpit. One struck him in the head. His Yak-1 rolled onto its side, then plunged into the forest. The impact shattered trees for 30 meters. The wreck burned for hours. He never made it out. Viktor Vasilievich Talalihin died at 23 years old, less than 3 months after his legendary ramming attack. The Soviets declared him immortal, but somewhere deep in Soviet archives, someone wrote a final note in his file. Pilot Talalihin refused political assignment, preferred active combat. Risk factor high. Maybe he died a hero. Maybe he died because he wouldn't be controlled. Maybe he died because he couldn't stop fighting. History would never agree.
The news of his death spread fast, faster than truth, faster than grief. Radio Moscow didn't broadcast it at first. The Soviet government feared the psychological impact. The people needed heroes, living heroes. So they delayed the announcement. His regiment buried what was left of him under a stand of birch trees, away from cameras, away from speeches. For 2 days, his death was a military secret. When it was finally announced, it came wrapped in poetry and propaganda. Talalihin falls, but the sky still belongs to Soviet wings. They turned him into a legend again. A martyr now. He wasn't allowed to just be a soldier who fought and died. He
he had to be a story. The birth of a Soviet myth. Within weeks, Talalekin's name was written into history textbooks. He became the official symbol of Taran, the unique Soviet tactic of air-to-air ramming. But what the public didn't know was this. Taran had existed before Talalekin. More than 200 Soviet pilots had already rammed enemy aircraft by the end of 1941. The tactic wasn't new. It was just necessary. The Red Air Force had been shattered in the opening phase of Operation Barbarossa. In the first 10 days alone, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 4,000 Soviet aircraft, most of them still on the ground. Soviet pilots were forced into the sky with bad radios, faulty oxygen gear, scarce ammunition, and sometimes no gun sights at all. When you can't outgun your enemy, the only thing left is impact. In a classified morale report from the 3rd Air Army, one chilling line was discovered years later. Ramming was not taught, it emerged out of necessity. Pilots will ram rather than abandon their posts. In other words, Taran wasn't a tactic, it was a last stand. And while Stalin's government praised ramming as the ultimate act of Soviet heroism, many aviators hated it.
Inside the mind of a Taran pilot. Decades later, after the war, a Soviet fighter ace named Boris Kovzin, who survived 4 ramming attacks, was asked why Soviet pilots used Taran. His answer was brutally honest. "We didn't want to die. We wanted to win." Another pilot said, "When you have bullets, you shoot. When you don't, you ram. It's simple." But Taran was not simple. It was terrifying, violent, primitive. It was flying straight into death and hoping physics gave you mercy. The average life expectancy of a Western Front fighter pilot in 1941 was 3 days. Calling Taran heroism made it sound noble, clean, but in truth, it was desperation in its purest form. Talalekin didn't invent it. He survived it once and died fighting like every other pilot, alone in the sky, against impossible odds. A legacy of iron and smoke. After his death, Viktor Talalekin's name was given to streets, lecture halls, a fighter regiment, schools, and eventually a statue in Moscow. His story was told to every generation of Soviet children, a symbol of fearless sacrifice. But here's the question history keeps circling back to. Was Viktor Talalekin a propaganda creation or a real hero in a war that destroyed men faster than it could honor them? The truth. He was both. He didn't ram that bomber because he wanted to die. He rammed it because he refused to lose. Because he was a hunter from Siberia who had spent his entire life fighting things bigger than himself. Because when it came down to it, he did what he always did. He chased his enemy, and he didn't stop, not even when the bullets ran out. His story isn't about one ramming attack. It's about what a human being is capable of when everything else is gone: hope, comfort, weapons, help, and only willpower remains.